Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and I am joined today by Samantha Kamman from the Christian Post. We are diving into the 2025 National Leadership Summit. Samantha, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about this event?
So, Israel Campus Coalition has this annual National Leadership Summit, and this year we had hundreds of pro-Israel students gather in DC last week to hear from political leaders and participants that are pro-Israel advocates who had them participate in workshops where they discussed issues impacting Israel, the Middle East, how to organize on campus. And this year, the event's very timely because it comes shortly after Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel and a wave of anti Israel protests on college campuses and lawsuits against several universities from Jewish students who said that these schools not only allowed the anti Israel bias to persist, but they weren't doing anything to stop anti Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously for the past 2 years now, we have essentially been watching anti Semitism rise. And it was rising even before that. And there's so much debate and consternation surrounding what's happening in Gaza, and that sort of further fuels some of this. You had a chance to speak, obviously, with some of the Jewish students who were at this event about anti Semitism on campus. And we often see the headlines, but getting to talk to people who are actually experiencing or dealing with this is a totally different dynamic. What most struck you about those conversations?
So you're correct. Yeah, I got to get some real insight into what was going on those campuses. I spoke with Shoshana Afsian of Bernard College, the sister college of Columbia University, and Talia Khan of MIT. So, a couple of things you often hear about these anti-Israel protests that were going on these campuses is like, oh, they weren't anti-Semitic, they were just anti-Israel, and they were peaceful. This is their First Amendment right. Here's some things that these students described, and I'll let people be the judge. So, Shoshana recalls that activists interrupted class taught by an Israeli professor, handed out flyers showing a boot pressing down on the Star of David. She was also there earlier this year when activists took over Butler Library. She was studying for finals when she suddenly heard a commotion. A bunch of people forced their way in, refused to leave. It was so chaotic. At least two public safety officers were injured, and the New York Police Department had to get involved, arrested around 80 people. Talia remembers immediately after October 7th, so this is before Israel even went in to Gaza to eradicate Hamas and rescue some of the hostages. She remembered immediately after October 7th, students and staff were sharing emails, signing on to it, condemning Israel, praising Hamas's actions as a form of resistance. She told me there was a study group she was in with several girls who were instantly saying, oh, free Palestine, and again, framing Hamas as resistant fighters. And she tried to have a conversation with them. And she said, well, what about the victims at the Nova Music Festival, where Hamas attacked this dance event and slaughtered like over 400 attendees? And these girls said, well, those people deserve to die. They were partying on stolen land. And she also had issues with her lab mates, who one lab mate even said, Jews shouldn't mourn October 7th victims. It's just unfair to victims of genocide in Palestine. And just again, loud demonstrations where activists were loudly calling for the destruction of the state of Israel.
That must have been, I would imagine, terrifying. I mean, did you get a sense that these young people were in fear as they were describing those events that they were seeing on their campuses?
They mentioned how it made Jewish students not feel very safe. They didn't feel comfortable. And I imagine there's a lot of frustration because there's all this misinformation out there that you have your fellow classmates and even some faculty members out there expressing support for terrorist organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost unimaginable and unbelievable. And you raise an interesting point that some of these things were happening because a lot of people say, well, it's because of Israel going into Gaza, but some of this stuff was happening immediately after October 7th, before that even happened. Did you get a sense, because obviously we're talking about anti-Semitism on campuses after October 7th. Did you get a chance of how it has changed in the wake of October 7th? These sorts of events that we're seeing now, were they present on campuses before, from what we know? If they were, was it as pronounced as what we've seen? I'm just curious of the change that unfolded after that terror attack.
So, anti Semitism is one of the world's oldest evils, been around a long time, but here are some things of note. The Anti Defamation League recorded around 10,000 anti Semitic incidents across the United States, which is the highest number on record since they began tracking these incidents over 40 years ago. This was in 2024. And some key points: college campuses in this time period became epicenters of anti Semitic activity. It was nearly 1 in 5 of all reported cases. And most of the reports had to do with anti-Israel protests, talking about the state of Israel, Zionism. And the ADL noted that it was a shift in traditional hotspots for anti-Semitism, saying previously it was K through 12 schools, residential areas, public areas, but now most incidents through 2024 were taking place at institutes of higher education.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly there are some shifts unfolding despite this not being a new issue. What else should people know about the 2025 National Leadership Summit? Again, it seems like it came at a very interesting time with everything going on right now.
So, just I would want to highlight some of the speakers. You had Rachel Goldberg Poland and John Poland. They were the parents of the murdered hostage Hirsch. They spoke at the event along with former hostages Keith and Aviva Segal. And, they just talked about trying to find hope in a time of darkness. Hirsch's dad, in particular, was urging Jewish students, don't be afraid, proudly wear symbols that showcase your faith. Just go out there, be Jewish, don't be afraid to show it.
Yeah, well, and they've been, I mean, his parents have been huge champions of just speaking out. Obviously, they had hoped for a very different outcome, and they've been very passionate and powerful speakers. I've interviewed them, and every time I've talked to them, I've just been moved by their story. And I think, when you look at an event like this, it's incredibly important that we examine and have these conversations, because the fact that we have anti-Semitism raging the way that we do right now shows the need for education. Now, I do, before we go, want to touch on Columbia University's crackdown on anti-Israel actions on campus. This is something that you have also covered. Obviously, the critique has been that campuses didn't do enough to stop this. You now have this Columbia crackdown. What's going on there? What happened there?
So, Columbia University did announce earlier this month it had disciplined around 70 students who participated in the protest at Butler Library and an encampment during the alumni weekend in spring 2024. Consequences include suspensions, expulsions, and in some cases, revoked degrees. I asked Shoshana about this, and she said it's a step in the right direction, saying that, yeah, if you're going to be taking over buildings and spaces on campuses, then you don't belong at university. But she still wants to see the school continue to apply these rules if similar protests arrive within the coming school year and remain committed to protecting Jewish students on campus. So it seems like the mindset is okay, yeah, something happened, but let's continue to see progress here.
Absolutely. Well, Samantha, I appreciate you breaking this all down. And, I guess one more question for you. I like to sometimes ask you this because you're on the ground, you're dealing with these stories. And, as a Christian and as a journalist, right? How do narratives and stories like this shape you? This story in particular, how has it maybe impacted you as you're diving in and covering what is happening in real time, this real discrimination against the Jewish people and against Israel? How has it affected you?
Well, especially as a Christian journalist, it makes you think on what are our duties to the Jewish people. Obviously, God still holds them very dearly, and He made a promise to them that He would provide this land for them. And as Christians, how does He want us to treat them? And I imagine He wants us to protect them. And even just all the information you see being put out there about Israel, either on college campuses or from the news media, it makes me want to be very careful in my reporting. I want to make sure I don't just blindly trust statistics that come out from Gaza authorities, knowing that Hamas controls that area. And I want to make sure I have a full understanding of what the Israeli military is trying to do, because I don't want to contribute to narratives that may paint Israel as the villain in this situation when the issue is much more complex about that, and it's trying to defend itself and protect its people.
Well, Samantha, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post. You can read the stories we talked about and much, much more. And as for this show, you can tune in next week for another episode. We'll see you then.